Welcome to the Balance Protocol podcast. If you are looking to regain your health, get the most out of life, or even resolve a chronic disease that has been plaguing you for years, this is the place. During an era where countless people are feeling the weight of ill health and whose heads are spinning due to all the noise and confusion within the info space, Dr. Beck is here to cut through all that noise and misinformation, to bridge the gap between medicine, scientific research, and where everything should truly be centered within you. Backed with 2 decades of professional clinical experience, Dr. Beck applies a revolutionary systems biology called functional medicine, utilizing his powerful method called the Balance Protocol. Here, Dr. Beck will educate you on the root causes of disease, motivate you to take solid corrective actions in your life, and inspire you to reach the highest levels of well-being. He knows that at the end of the day, it is you, the patient, who holds the keys to your ultimate health and well-being. It's time for the Balance Protocol with Dr. Anthony G. Beck.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Balance Protocol podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony G. Beck, and in today's show, we're going to have a little bit of fun, and I'm going to go over what I call good science versus bad science. So I'm going to discuss how there seems to be a trend of so many in the info space using the word quote-unquote science quite inappropriately. And then we're going to reveal how you can actually spot the ones who manipulate that term science. And I'm going to teach you how to challenge these claims so you can always get the balanced understanding. And then I'm going to show you the silliness that sucks so many people into confusion. And lastly, I'm going to give you 10 methods in how to sort through good science versus bad science and basically determine if something quoted as science is valid. Science has long been the hub for intellectual thinking. A lot of things have been done under what I call the banner of science. Whenever someone wants to leverage credibility for what their agenda is, they will often turn to the good old, well, according to science, or science is proven, or science has shown, or science links this to that. We've all heard of this, so it's one of those kind of things where it's very ubiquitous in things that we read on Facebook or different blogs and so forth. So again, whenever you see the word science, I want you to be mentally anchored to this particular podcast. So I want you to ask yourselves, how many times did you actually go and look up the science that was quoted to you when you read something or heard something? Or do you do like the vast majority of us and just let that proclaimed mantle of science be the convincing factor for us in that discussion? Just because what we heard or read was waving that banner of what they call science doesn't necessarily mean that it is or that it's actually good or valid science. Okay, I'm going to teach you how to decipher the difference between those things. And I want to really encourage you to learn how to sort through all these all too common supposed quotes from science. It's super important because many of the reasons why our current state of health today is because people just go with whatever they're told by those who they think are authorities and who they think have their best interest at heart. Well, guess what? That is just not the case. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Government entities are the ones who put out messages and programs that match the agreed upon agenda when it comes to a policy. And we all know that politicians form their agendas and policies based on lobbyists and organizations who have skin in the game. It's a crazy model of doing things, but no one seems to know or even care because we just keep doing this type of system and keeping it in place. Think about it. If you're a major corporation and you want to get your product to as many people as you can and in return make as much profit as you can, you need to expand your efforts to the market by whatever means will achieve this mission. What better way than to access the largest corporate board of executives that can adopt your product? Well, that's the United States federal government. So this plan starts by sending your sales reps to the offices of those executives who can pull the strings and make decisions. This example is, of course, the lobbyists of, say, food manufacturers, commodity brokers of corn, soy, and wheat, heading up to Capitol Hill. You then have your sales team provide these executives with all kinds of numbers that, if bought into, will convert to dollars. And those numbers are usually going to be the very thing that I'm talking about right now, claiming science. That message then turns those dollars into benefits for the executive and the area of the country they represent. So the point is, policy and how we are affected in the realms of health is not determined by science. Actually, it's developed and is determined by specific lobbies, by popularity, and by what would be profitable. Heck, even politicians surely don't read or go research what these lobbyists give them as science. We know examples of they haven't even really read bills before they pass them, especially when it comes to healthcare. But don't get me started on that. They just go on the assumption of it being true because these guys gave it to them and told them it would be the best thing for the nation. Now, as physicians, we see the same exact mechanism, but with slightly different players in our medical practices. This is the same cycle of drug reps and medical equipment sales reps. The trouble comes when individuals relinquish their lives to this particular mechanism. Then we sit back and wonder why we have the state of affairs in our world of healthcare. Another example that is epically a pandemic in the info space is what I call the parroted misinformation reflex. Some writers for some online venues need to come up with an article or a topic for content. They want to keep feeding people to keep coming back to get website visits. So they turn to headlines in the news. These headlines are usually based off some press release by some company who did some study that worked with their agenda. This company claimed that science showed that their such and such did such and such. So to get the word out as part of their marketing and advertising campaign, they do a press release. This press release gets picked up and reported by the blog writer I just mentioned. This blogger then proceeds to write about it and claim the backing of science. There the cycle begins. Because if some trusted news site and then some blogger is writing about someone claiming science, then it must be true, right? Nope. It's just marketing content. And I'm going to give you some really comical examples of that here in just a second. So it says nothing for the validity, nor does it speak to any application of you and your individual genetics, lifestyle, or environment. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that every and all things we read and see reported or blogged about are false and nefarious, and they're not all necessarily manipulations of the concept of science. There's a lot of good quality stuff out there. What I'm saying is half of it is. The trick is to determine which half is true and which half is BS. So in today's show, I'm going to teach you how to determine that for yourself. What that half is, that is the stuff that stinks. So let me give you a funny example I use in my keynote presentations to medical professionals I use when asked to speak on topics of nutrition and health. Usually as an icebreaker, I'll say something, I'll ask the crowd if they think science has been proven unequivocally that saturated fat clogs the arteries. It's hilarious the amount of hands I see go up affirming that supposed and commonly accepted fact of science. I put a slide up that shows a picture of a study I did. And what the picture is are two particular things. And then it says, fats that are solid at room temperature clog the arteries, right? Because after all, it's the fact that it's solid, like butter, at room temperature, right? But then I say, what we truly do know is that there is no living human being whose internal temperature is 70 some odd degrees. And in fact, it's close to 100 degrees. I then say, show me any fat that humans eat that is solid at 100 degrees. I then put up a slide of some butter and lard out on my porch in Florida beside a banana and a carrot. Lo and behold, the fat turns to liquid, but the veggies stay solid. Poof, there you have it. Veggies clog arteries, not fat. We all shouldn't eat those anymore, and I'll be dang if I want to be done in by a banana. Well, I get some laughs in the audience, and I say, well, all joking aside, people are intimidated by science and scientists. They also don't necessarily know that they can challenge the ideals that are out there under this supposed banner of science. I believe this is because if you read a study and you see a formula like gluconeogenesis from amino acids or the citric acid cycle, or you see all the fancy scientific jargon, you just kind of check out. Most people don't want to see that techie kind of stuff or that sciencey kind of stuff, and much less have the time to look into it. A lot of us scientific geek types, I love that. I don't read stories or nonfiction. Give me a textbook or something like that, and that's where my mind really begins to feed. So you don't have to be capable of all that type of math to understand how science works and how to separate the good from the bad. It's so vital to learn how to do this so we can be self-protectors of our health. Remember, the world was kept in the dark by the powers that be for thousands of years before the printing press. All the time, we see articles on the internet come out and say things like, eggs linked to diabetes. Then you'll see one that says, eggs improve glucose control. Then, processed meats are linked to cancer. Then another week you'll see, hot dogs may prevent cancer. All of those were real and did appear in the media, by the way. This is why it's so important for you to know how these studies are conducted and what the data that comes from them really means. We need to start by something that is hardwired into being human, and that is pattern recognition. Seeing that when A is done, that B happens. We have all had to learn this to survive, and when you're hungry, you eat, you feel better. We know if you drink pure water, you'll be fine. If you drink from stagnant ponds, you get sick. So here's my fun example. People are like those teenagers in slasher movies. They're out in the woods and someone hears a noise. Someone has to go check it out. So they go running into this dark cabin or woodshed and squoosh, they disappear. But we hear the sounds, right? So then the second one wonders what happened to the first one, and they go and check it out. And then whoosh, and then they disappear. Then the third one wonders what happened to those two, and then they go check it out. And the same thing. You hear whoosh, and blood squirt everywhere, and they disappear. By the time the fourth one starts heading to the woodshed, we're all thinking, what the heck is wrong with you people? So the point is, making the connection between A and B is so hardwired into the brain, it can oftentimes fool us. So much so that every time we perceive, quote unquote, A is connected to B, that A must be causing B. Now, psychologists name this the belief engine. And our brains are constantly looking for connections of A to B. So much so that if we spot connections, we begin to generate new beliefs on how the world works. But here's the fun part. When we're looking for these, we tend to latch on to the ones consistent with those we already have, or at least the ones that don't contradict our current or previous beliefs. Now, this is called confirmation bias. So think American Indians here, and they believe that the sky gods give them rain. So one day, when they're in desperate need of rain, they put on all their best festive clothes and they invent the rain dance. And they began to dance and dance and dance. Sure enough, a few days later it rains. The connection's made. If A, dance with festive clothes, then B, the sky god is happy and makes it rain. This is called the belief engine. And I'm going to come back to that term in just a little bit. But you see, this is where science comes in. Science is defined by, here's the quote, the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment, end quote. So, what is science? Knowledge. It's a set of facts or principles, knowledge gained by systematic study. Science is the mechanism to let us objectively answer questions. 1, is there a connection between A and B? If so, number 2, does A cause B to happen? If so, 3, how does A cause B to happen? Even if number 3 is not known, we do know things can clearly happen even though we don't know why. And that is actually an okay thing. So here's the deal. The way scientists are supposed to answer these questions is by applying what is called the scientific method. Shouldn't be a new term to most of us out there. I'm sure you'll remember back to high school or at least middle school, but let's have a quick review of scientific method. Number 1, you make observations so you can gather data. Number 2, you form a hypothesis based on your observations, and it must be testable. Number 3, conduct experiments. Number 4, collect data from experiments. Number 5, reach a conclusion based on data, based on thorough, careful, objective analysis. Okay? So here's when it becomes science. When the hypothesis is validated by results that are consistent and repeatable. So it's really important to understand that concept. So let me say that again. You have to be able to observe it, and the results are consistent and repeatable. This is really the utmost importance because it is accurate to say that experiments are studies, but not all studies are experiments. In fact, most are not. In health, medicine, and nutrition, there are 2 types of studies. There are observational studies and there are clinical studies. And I'm going to share with you the difference. Observational studies do number 1 and number 2 of scientific method. So for a reminder, those are number 1, make observations so you can gather data. Number 2, form a hypothesis. Clinical studies do those, plus they do number 3, number 4, and number 5. And here's a reminder of those. Conduct experiments, collect data from experiments, and then reach a conclusion based on data through careful objective analysis. Observational studies are just that. We're watching something. In most cases, it's people. There is no intervention, no treatment. We watch them and gather data. Observational studies are incapable of proof. It will always be conjecture. When we gather the data, we look for traits, behaviors, and results that are associated, also known as correlated or also stated as linked. But see, the problem is when an article or a blog says, studies show, or studies show association, correlation, or linked, it translates to most that this is science, but it is not. Remember, science is knowledge. It's all a matter of terms and how they translate meaning over to those who hear or read it. Again, if they do relate, then we can say, now pay attention to this phrase, quote unquote, statistically associated. So wow, if something is statistically associated, now that's math and science, right? How can we argue with that? Well, let me clear that one up too. It simply means we can plot the associated data on a plot chart. Anyone who's taken statistics knows what I'm talking about. And there's a huge problem associated with observational studies and subsequent plotting of the data into statistics. And I'm going to give you some examples. There are observational studies that show that A, for example, the kids of parents who read to their kids and keep a lot of books in the house, B, tend to do better in school. So there you have it. A causes B, right? Reading to your kids causes them to get better grades, right? And most people go, well, yeah, that totally makes sense. Wrong. Because when researchers really looked into the data within those groups, good, bad, and mediocre students, they found that the amount of time that parents read to them and the number of books in the house made almost no difference at all. So why would we see this strong correlation? Well, intelligent people are more likely to enjoy books, buy books, and read them to their kids. Intelligent people are more likely to raise intelligent offspring who go on to school because they're intelligent. So good science knows that just because A correlates to B that one does not cause the other. They can both be related to different things that the investigators were not looking for. That something else is actually called something. It has a name, and it's called a confounding variable. Observational studies are chock full of confounding variables. If the researchers aren't looking for them, they might not spot them at all. Remember that belief engine I talked about earlier? The one where I said that when we are looking for correlations or connections between A and B, we tend to latch onto those things that do not contradict our current or previous belief. Well, let's do our own observational study and show how this might work. So here's our study population. It's 10 people who are going to make up 4 different groups. Okay, high fat, high sugar, going to have 40% of the people or 4 people. High fat, low sugar, it's 20% or 2 people. And then we're going to go to low fat, high sugar, 2 people or 20%. And then the low fat, low sugar, another 2 people making 20%. Okay, so we've got high fat, high sugar, high fat, low sugar, low fat, high sugar, low fat, low sugar. Here's what happens. 3 people in the high fat, high sugar develop heart disease. 1 person in the low fat, high sugar develops heart disease. Now, what correlations am I going to pull out of this data? If you said it depends upon your belief engine, then you're a genius and you've been paying attention. But if you're still thinking, I'm going to help you out here. The fact is that by the looks of this, 2/3 in high sugar groups developed heart disease in this population. Now, if through my whole career I've been conditioned to believe that high fat caused heart disease, I am more apt to notice this correlation. In the high fat groups, 1/2 develop heart disease, and in the low fat groups, only 25% or 1/4 got heart disease. Well, I've spotted the connection. A equals B. High fat causes heart disease. Here is where it really gets felonious. I see this all the time. I could send out a press release about that study and make it say, high-fat diet doubles heart disease risk. In observational studies, you'll see that term so much of the time. Doubles your risk, raises your risk, or lowers your risk. And I'm going to come back to that study, but I'll give you another example of that. Articles will say things like, egg consumption may raise risk of type 2 diabetes. And here's what happens to millions of people when they read something like that, including journalists and bloggers. Let's suppose I watch a movie like LA Confidential or Deer Hunter starring Robert De Niro one night. Afterwards, I think it'd be really cool to play Russian roulette. So I get out a 6-shooter and put 1 bullet in it, give it a spin. What are the odds I'm going to end up with a deadly migraine? It's not a trick question. What are the odds? It's 1 out of 6, right? Now, what if that really didn't supply quite the adrenaline rush that I was hoping for? So next time I play, I put 2 bullets in the 6-shooter. What are the odds? 2 and 6. Now, I did literally double my chances, and it's a matter of cause and effect because my behavior has made it twice as likely that I'm going to shoot myself. So that silly headline, egg consumption raises diabetes risk, comes along, and the dum-dums are not careful with their language and say, the study showed a significant increase of new onset diabetes with regular egg consumption. They didn't even say associated with. They made it sound like it's cause and effect. So what people come away with is that every time you eat eggs, that it's like putting more bullets in your gun. In an observational study, that is not what raising your risk means. It just means that statistically, you would be put into one group instead of another group. And your group, on average, had more negative outcome. But what group you belong to depends on how the investigators wanted to slice and dice the data. So let's go back to you in the high-fat, low-sugar group. If the puppet masters decide to slice and dice data according to fat intake, you belong to the high-fat group. And according to the data, that means you are at a higher risk of cardiovascular disease. But if they decide to analyze based upon the sugar grouping, the low sugar groups have a lower risk, and now you have a lower risk of cardiovascular disease. Now enters what's called the law of non-contradiction. Your diet cannot be causing and preventing cardiovascular disease at the same time. And quite frankly, since this is an observational study, we don't know. There are simply statistical categories. They do not tell us anything about cause and effect. So let's have one more example for fun and a lot less thinking. And you can kind of go back to that in the show notes, by the way, if you want to follow along with this or understand that point just a little bit more. But here's a fun one. And this is an observational study. Studies have shown that girls who quit high school are much more likely to end up as pregnant teenagers than girls who do not. So statistically, quitting school raises your risk of becoming pregnant. Now, does anyone think that quitting school makes you pregnant? Anyone ever had a pregnant teen come home and say, "Oh my gosh, she must have quit school"? No. And if that is the case, then all of us need to go back to school and retake biology. And oh, by the way, stay away from those girls who are potential dropouts while you're there, right? So if any of you are looking to get pregnant but can't, just go back to school and drop out, boom, you'll get pregnant. Now, see, this is funny stuff, but this is what happens so often. And seriously, this is one of the reasons why so many people are confused about what is correct and what is that 50% that's BS. This is why good science knows that correlation does not prove causation. And this is because observational study only brings us to steps 1 and 2 of the scientific method. It can only provide data to inquire more about contributing to certain things. It is not and cannot ever be proof. This is why when good scientists are looking for proof, they conduct the other type of study or a clinical study. Those are the kinds that really matter because you can control your variables. However, before we go giving them the keys to the kingdom, they have problems inherent to them as well. I'm going to show you that, but first, I'm going to give you this example. In a typical clinical study, we put together 2 or more groups that are quote-unquote statistically the same. So that's in quotes, remember that, statistically the same, and we'll refer back to that in a second. Now, this makes sense because if we're going to try to do a study and one group was, say, full of smokers and the other was not, we know that the smokers are going to skew the data. So in clinical studies, we try to balance the groups based upon certain things like gender, race, age, socioeconomic status, predisposing factors, previous family history, etc., etc. And then with those variables in control, we change one variable only. So the example would be one group goes on a diet and the other doesn't. One group takes a drug and the other takes a placebo. So neither group knows what they're getting. Then since we controlled our variables, if one group has a statistically different outcome, we can be pretty sure changing the variable made the difference. But let me give you a real-life example. For years, researchers have been pulling data out of a huge observational study called the Harvard Nurses Health Study. And this study followed 121,000+ female registered nurses since 1976 and 116,000 female nurses since 1989. And it was designed to assess risk factors for cancer and cardiovascular disease, the top 2 causes of death in the country. One of the things they found was that middle-aged nurses who took estrogen had a 40% less risk of heart disease. Oh my heavens, what a fabulous finding, so many people were thinking. So now you had bad scientists and bad doctors wanting to prescribe estrogen to all middle-aged women on the planet based on an observational study. The good scientists said, hold on a minute, correlation does not prove causation. We need to do a clinical study. And guess what? They did. It was a huge clinical study called HERS that included 16,000 women and lasted 5.5 years. It was the heart and estrogen / progestin replacement study. And guess what the clinical study showed? Women had 30% more cardiovascular disease and strokes. There was another clinical study later that pretty much proved the same results. So how could there be such different results? How could this be? If estrogen does not protect against cardiovascular disease, why would an observational study show us that taking estrogen lowered risk by 40%? Well, it's simple. It's the confounding variable of health-conscious people are different from the population as a whole. Compared to the whole population, they're less likely to smoke, drink too much, consume sodas, candies, etc., and they're more likely to exercise, get enough sleep, take dietary supplements, and see the doctor if they get ill. The answer was that estrogen was not giving them healthier hearts, but health-conscious women were more likely to take estrogen and lower cardiovascular disease because they were health-conscious, and their health habits were more likely to offset the estrogen, which was not good for their hearts. So there we have it, observational versus clinical studies. Most of what you read in the media are observational studies. This is generally because they're usually short and don't have a long format, and they're not as expensive. So when you see a TV news show or read a blogger on the internet tell some tale that gets your attention, go find the study. Imagine that. You actually going to question and investigate for yourself. Wow. Want to know why people are so confused? Because they allow themselves to be confused. And you want to know why those powers that be keep doing this bad type of science? Because we let them. We keep falling for it. The bad science folks know that this works beautifully. If there's no link in the write-up or the show or that you see this on TV, then what you do is this. Here's your tool. You go to Google Scholar, and you put in the investigator or the research group name, as well as the journal where the study was published, along with a couple keywords. Bam. It should often show right up there at the top. Most likely, you will find what's called the abstract. Sometimes in the abstract, you will see a link to the full text of the study. Now, here's what most reporters do, and notice I don't call them journalists. They glance through the study and scroll through to the end and find what's called the conclusion. Then they go write their story based on that. They use phrases like study showed or studies prove. You see, one of the problems is that these are non-scientists and non-clinicians who are writing this junk. And there are endless blogs filled with nothing but headline after headline that is titillating and provocative. Now, the dirty secret is that people have been conditioned to want this type of what is called content. And in the online world of websites and marketing and stuff, they say that, content is king. So it's always this thirst to put more stuff out there that will get more clicks. And there's seldom any application in it for most people to apply in their lives. It's simply like junk publications we see at the grocery store checkouts. People give attention to this junk, and that means outlets can sell the advertising. They'll generally have some article link on a blog post or some news feed, and you'll have just this beguiling picture, and then you're like, well, what the heck is that? And you click it, and it has nothing to do with the story. So you've probably succumbed to this type of mechanism before. So there you have it. I just spilled the beans. I'm the whistleblower on the internet. So I want you to learn how to combat this with some real critical thinking. And this is because I uphold and respect one of the oldest traditions in science. And what's that? Well, scientists are freaking liars. The Latin diagnosis I give it is Pinocchiotis freakinitis. And there was even an article titled Lies, Damn Lies, and Medical Science. And this was back in the November 2010 of the journal The Atlantic. And you can Google that, by the way. Written by a doctor who spent decades of his career challenging his peers by exposing their bad science. He was in Harvard MD and a mathematical genius, a Dr. John Ioannidis, I believe is how you pronounce it. And he spent lots and lots of time studying studies. And here's a great quote from the article. Quote, "He and his team have shown again and again in so many different ways that much of what biomedical researchers conclude in published studies conclusions that doctors keep in mind when they prescribe blood pressure medications or when they advise us to consume more fiber or less meat, is misleading, exaggerating, and often flat out wrong. He charges that as much as 90% of the published medical information that doctors rely upon is flawed, end quote. Pretty amazing. And another very interesting quote in this article is, quote, when it came to cancer, cardiovascular disease, and other common ailments, there was plenty of published research, but much of it was remarkably unscientifically based and based largely on observations. 80% of the conclusions drawn from non-randomized observational studies turned out to be wrong, close quote. He even goes on to say that 20 to 25% of conclusions from clinical trials are wrong. So how can this be? Well, he says researchers were fundamentally manipulating data analysis, chasing career-advancing methods rather than good science, and even using the peer-reviewed process to suppress opposing views. There's even a current Nobel Prize laureate in the news this week who is proclaiming that he's actually boycotting the peer-reviewed journals because this is becoming such a problem. Okay, so here's the balanced understanding. I told you that I was going to teach you how to investigate investigations. So here's your balanced protocol. It's 10 critical thinking methods now. Number one, you ask, is it an observational study or a clinical study? Now, if it's an observational study, this doesn't mean it's worthless. It just tells us that they're at steps 1 and 2 of scientific method and that a connection is spotted. Think of it as a way to define a hypothesis that moves fully through scientific method. It never shows or lends proof, it's just an observation. Okay? Number 2, if A is linked to B, could it be because of C? Now recall the kids in the books and home as well as the nurse's story for number 2. Number 3, could B cause A? So if we look at runners in marathons and they're all thin, none are obese, then running must cause a lean body. But if we do that, could B equals A. But does having a lean body make you run? Well, I guess since basketball players are all tall, then playing basketball will make you taller. Here's another one. What kind of people are on a fat loss diet? Fat people, or those who think that they're fat. So tell me, fat people go on diets, so do diets make you fat? Well, okay, that's a trick question because most diets do contribute to making you fat in the long run, sorry. But here you go. So for fun, Google this. Floor caves under Weight Watchers weigh-in. And here's the spoiler. It's entirely a true headline story. So does Weight Watchers damage floors? According to the question number 3, does B cause A? So here's number 4. Is A linked to B consistently? Or do we see these glaring exceptions across populations? And an example of that is we're told that saturated fat is linked to cardiovascular disease. Yep, okay. Unless you're French, Swiss, the Inuits, the Maasai tribe, Spanish, or other what they call paradox populations, okay? We've been told that red meat is linked to colon cancer, and it is, except in several studies where it wasn't. Like the study from Oxford University, which showed, and here's the quote, within the study, the incidence of all cancers combined was lower among vegetarians than among meat eaters, but the incidence of colorectal cancer was higher in vegetarians than in meat eaters. Isn't that interesting? So, ever hear the good old A, power lines, B causes cancer. So, A equals B, power lines cause cancer. So why don't we see huge populations of electrical linemen who spend hours and hours of every day as a career around these big power lines getting all this cancer? Well, we don't. So sure, do I believe that high voltage EM arrays like that can contribute? Well, sure. However, it's not an A causes B. It's only part of the puzzle. Just like the C. Of those who were reported to have this cancer increase around power lines, they actually were in poverty. So was it the lines or was it the poverty spectrum, you see? So we'll move on to number 5. In this study, who were the subjects? Ask yourself, are those included in this study equal to me? That shouldn't be so hard, right? So here's an example. And I saw this in the news, and most likely it'll sound familiar to you. How fatty foods lead to diabetes. Junk food inflammation may trigger diabetes. So the study is quoted as saying, quote, this study's results support the idea that inflammation plays a role in chronic disease. Well, they extrapolate to say the simple message is to avoid fatty foods as much as possible. So I checked out the study, and it turns out a diet high in saturated fat does seem to produce inflammation in this segment of the population. But wait for it. What segment of the population? Mice. Now you know why the mice who kill and eat so many cows and pigs have so many heart problems. Now, I'm not saying that animal studies are worthless, but the thing is, when investigators feed a diet that is not like ours, or when they feed a diet to an animal that is completely unnatural to them, I don't care what the results are. I don't care if they can cause cancer in rats by feeding them an isolated cow protein, because I don't believe we've ever seen vast populations of mice sucking on the udders of cows in the barn, right? So besides, if they could milk those cows, they certainly don't have the technology to separate those proteins. So that brings us on to number 6. What was the difference? Okay, difference. In math, difference means subtraction, like 103 minus 102 equals 1. Now, here is what the disease Pinocchiotis freakinitis will cause you to do. Instead of absolute change determined by subtraction, they switch to relative change by division, which tends to be a much more impressive number. Now, here's a famous example of how this works. We've probably all heard of the drug Lipitor. Lipitor studies were conducted on men who were already at high risk for heart disease. Did you catch that? Already at risk for heart disease. Now, after 10 years, here were the results. The Lipitor group, 2 out of 100 men suffered heart attack. In the placebo group, 3.05 out of the 100 men suffered heart attack. Now, the difference is 3.05 minus 2. That equals 1.05 heart attacks for every 100 men. In other words, if you took 100 men with multiple risk factors for heart disease and then you gave them this drug for 10 years, you would in theory be preventing 1 heart attack out of that group of 100. This, of course, is not an impressive number. Now, let's apply the magic of division and apply the relative change due to our Pinocchiotis freakinitis. Take the small number, divide by the bigger, then subtract the result from 1, and that will give you the relative change as a decimal. So if you're trying to do this in your head while you're listening, I'll make it real easy for you. So Lipitor, 2 divided by that 3.5 equals 0.65. So we take that 0.65, subtract it from 1, and equals 0.35. And we just convert that to a percent. So they can now plaster the media universe with titles and headlines. Lipitor reduces risk of heart disease by 35%. This translates into people thinking, wow, over a third of the men on this drug are saving themselves from heart attacks. No, it's only 1 in 100. That's 1 maybe. If you're a male under 65 who already has high risk for heart disease. But here's the other thing no one ever seems to hear. One of those cleverly marketed commercials on TV where they tell you that if you think Lipitor is right for you, ask your doctor. Well, yeah, I think Lipitor is right for me because I want to keep riding my bike on the beach with my honey and feeding the seagulls. But at the end of the commercial, it says, when diet and exercise have failed, choose Lipitor. But of course, they say that with that hugely proportionally low volume and then the high-speed talk. And it's ironic because if you eat healthy and keep riding your bike on the beach with your honey and feeding the seagulls, you don't need that poison Lipitor. So you see, it's all on how things translate to you, the consumer. In studies, you'll often see the word significant. Now, significant is another term you got to look out for. Significant results, significant risk, significant increase or decrease. That's an impressive sounding word, isn't it? Significant. So here's another example. You see so many so-called health advisors, coaches, counselors, and whatnot ask people, how much is your salt intake? Let me tell you something. For the vast majority of the population, salt intake has a tiny effect on blood pressure. So I tell people not to worry about it. Why? Because the body has a powerful central governor system that excretes excess sodium. Of course, unless you have other pathology or renal failure and things of that nature, okay? But I'm talking about the vast population here. The problem from sodium excess is that it accompanies foods that are often crappy foods. So it goes back to correlation, not causation. This often, for me, draws kind of an angry response from detractors, and it's okay. I'm totally used to it after 20 years in clinical practice. So you see, when you have firsthand personal experience and invest countless hours into research, and you get this personal fortitude, it's the purpose of this particular show and my website to help you get to that same self-empowered place as well. This is why I try to inspire my patients to use this protocol of how to look at science claims, okay? And now when it goes down on Facebook, I get the proverbial scholar that drops in a link and says, obviously you haven't done your research, and go to this study which shows, quote unquote, significant reducing on blood pressure by restricting salt. Well, little do they know, this ain't my first rodeo, and that how I test their post is to go to PubMed and search the term I know they just searched, and 99% of the time it just so happens to be the first hit that comes up. So I know they simply did not like my clinical opinion, and they thought they would attempt to fight it by a quick pull of the PubMed search trigger and post up a study they didn't even research or evaluate. So what does the word mean significant? Okay, so what if I told you to go do exercise by jumping up and down in place 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week for a year, and at the end of that year, you lose a whopping 4 pounds of weight? Would you celebrate and call your friends and say, hey, this year I lost 4 pounds and all I had to do was jump up and down for 30 minutes a day for 260 days out of 365 in this year? And man, did I experience some significant weight loss. Of course you wouldn't. What if I told you I was 95% sure that it was this exercise that caused this and nothing else? Of course not, because for most of us, the term significant means impressive or meaningful or boldly important. That's not what it means to a scientist. Now, to a scientist, significant means greater than 95% certain that results are not due to chance statistically. So let's go back to salt consumption. Investigators put a group of people on a Mediterranean-type diet, but with a very high intake of salt. And then they measure their blood pressure for a few weeks later. When they switched them to a very, very low salt intake on the same diet, remember changing the one variable, and then measure their blood pressure, here were the results. On the salt, the blood pressure average was 126/81. Off the salt, the blood pressure average was 123/79. Now remember, these researchers were convinced and greater than 95% certain that these results were caused by salt reduction. So they thought it was significant. You see how that works? But for proving that lowering salt intakes lowers blood pressure, this study is meaningless. So when you meet a scientist who does these studies and they introduce you to their significant other, you can be sure that he is or she is 95% sure that they're not dating them by accident. Okay, so number 7, did the researchers control the variables? Example, so suppose I told you that according to my data, people who consume high levels of clear liquids, such as water, gin, and vodka, are more likely to have liver damage. Would you have a problem with that? Yes, well, of course you would. Remember back to Sesame Street. One of these things is not like the other. Obviously, water does not belong to that group. Just like the study that claimed red meat causes colon cancer. Well, to make that happen, they had to include red meat in with the processed meat like deli cuts, hot dogs, and beef byproduct. In other words, red meat that people typically consume with big blankets of white processed dough. When other researchers separated the red meat from the processed meat, there was no correlation found. So very poignant there. So number 8, compared to what? Okay, example, whole grains prevent heart disease, diabetes, and excess weight gain. Ever see those headlines? Yeah, so many of these studies are comparing whole grains to white flour products. Why is this important to understand? Suppose I compare people who smoke unfiltered cigarettes who have higher risk for cancer to people who smoke filtered cigarettes, which have lower risk of cancer. Could I then make the statement, filtered cigarettes prevent cancer? No, because filter cigarettes are not preventing cancer. They're just less likely. Okay? Number 9, do the results of the study support the conclusions? You would be shocked at how often they don't match. Remember my example, 30 minutes a day for 5 days for a full year, lose 4 pounds? That was from an actual clinical study. Here's what the investigators wrote. Quote, provides direct empirical evidence that previously sedentary, mostly overweight, postmenopausal women can achieve and sustain high levels of aerobic exercise that result in statistically significant reductions in all measures of adiposity. There you have it, folks. We've identified yet another case of Pinocchiotis freakinitis. So back to the salt study. Recall that drastic restriction in salt yielded a tiny drop in blood pressure. But the study is quoted in their conclusion, you know, the thing at the bottom of the study I told you about, and they said, our results prove support for a more aggressive target reduced sodium intake. I mean, what the heck does that mean? Okay, so here's one last study. 3 groups. Number 1 on a low carb, high fat. Number 2 on a low fat, moderate carb. And number 3 was the control group. The low carb, high fat group number 1 and the low fat mod carb both lost weight. But the low carb, high fat group lost more body fat and showed the greatest improvements in all cardiovascular markers, including total cholesterol, triglycerides, HDL, and LDL. Yet, what did the investigators write? Quote, moderate approaches to weight loss, such as moderate carbohydrate, low-fat diet may be prudent, end quote. Now, in case you don't know what prudent means, well, it means they want to continue to get research dollars funded from Kellogg, who actually funded the study. So that brings us to number 10. Who funded the study? There are infinite variables that come into play to get things to apply to you. You see, science that is not the study of literally you will not and cannot definitively tell you for you. Look, we all have to call them out on this. I love it when other doctors come at me for being so forthright in sharing these dirty secrets, especially those who attack me with the ad hominem logical fallacy that I'm not a research PhD or a medical doctor like them. You know how you can always spot the real producers of the problem? If they attack you and not the content of the argument. So not only am I going to question them, I'm going to poke fun at them. And we have to see the silliness in these things and laugh at ourselves for having fell for it. You know, I have found that once people are brought to the knowledge of how the information is manipulated within the banner of science and then leveraged out there in the info space, they can start to see and hear with a renewed zeal. It's this mechanism that usually serves as the catalyst to a whole new world of understanding. It's another way of thinking and realizing why so many were trying all this stuff they heard and it never worked for them. It's my passion and promise to bring you solid protocols like the 10 things we just covered. And again, you can reference back to the show notes and actually get those. And I will be ever vigilant to the reminder that you are truly a category of one and that you have to be your own clinical study. And if you find that what you find in you does not fit what the so-called science says, well, to hell with science. You know you better than any scientist or doctor. By doing so, I'll be able to achieve my life's passion and focus, which is to educate you on the true root cause of disease, motivate you to take solid corrective actions in your life, and inspire you to reach the highest levels of well-being. And now, guess what? All this I shared with you today, question it, go research it, prove yourself right. Become a scientist and make yourself the focus of your own clinical study. After all, at the end of the day, it's you who is in charge of attaining your highest levels of well-being. Well, folks, I hope you enjoyed today's show as much as I enjoyed sharing it with you. We had to laugh and poke fun at science just a little bit. I really hope you can learn those 10 methods and apply that protocol and ascertaining if something's good science versus bad science whenever you see something come down the pipeline. And for more information on things like this and the Balance Protocol or to join the Balance Nation, please head over to my website, DrAnthonyGbeck.com. You can also find me on Facebook.com/Dr. Anthony G. Beck. And lastly, if you could do me a big favor and be so kind as to take a few seconds and leave me a review on iTunes, I'd surely love you for it. And so until next time, remember, let's live life in balance.
Wait, don't stop listening yet. Thank you for listening to the Balance Protocol podcast. Be sure to head over to DrAnthonyGbeck.com, where you'll find lots of life-changing information that will educate, motivate, and inspire you to your highest levels of well-being. There, you can get access to exclusive content, as well as download your 100% free Urgent Health Report. You can also use the contact page to ask your health questions and make requests for topics you would like covered on future podcasts. Until then, let's live life in balance.